Hello and welcome to the second of the videos about the resource-based theory of strategy. Now remember, in this theory, competitive advantage comes from possessing unique and immobile resources. That means that competitors can't get hold of those resources, and so if those resources allow you to do something that customers value, you will have an advantage. Now whilst single resources can provide some advantage, it is likely that they are going to be copyable by competitors, and hence it is more likely that competencies, bundles of single resources that are integrated together, are more likely to be difficult to imitate and therefore more likely to give sustainable competitive advantage. Now, only a few of the firm's competencies, its core competencies, will give competitive advantage. Typically, even the most successful firms will have a maximum of 5 core competencies. Now, identifying those competencies and testing them to see if they provide competitive advantage is the subject of this video. Now, identifying competencies before you test them can be difficult, but there are some simple steps that you can take to make that a lot easier. Now, many of the textbooks will suggest that in identifying competencies, you should audit the resources that the organisation has, perhaps starting with Michael Porter's value chain and looking at each part of that framework to see what resources the firm has. Now, in my experience, that approach can take a long time and you get lost into which resources bundle together to make competencies and which of those actually make a difference to the firm. The approach I've always found much easier is to come from the customer perspective and to brainstorm why those customers choose to come to that company. So what it is the job that the firm is doing for customers that means they choose it over others. And having identified that, then drill down and say, okay, if that's what it is able to do, what competencies allow it to do that job for the customers? By taking that approach, you are automatically looking in the right space in terms of what's making a difference to the customer, and also you're already focusing on the competencies that make you different to competitors and so have a potential to deliver competitive advantage. Once you've done that, you then check that those competencies are indeed a bundle of resources. Now, this advice is very similar to that given by Prahalad and Hamel. They say look for competence that provide a significant benefit to customers and also that provide access to multiple markets and you expect to be difficult for competitors to imitate. Now, this is a brainstorming process and there are some tricks that you can use to try and make sure you're looking at the full range of the company's resources. Fowler and her fellow authors suggest a typology of competencies that might suggest other competencies that you may not first have thought about in your brainstorming. They talk about 3 different types of competencies: function-related competencies, and those are the technical capabilities of the organisation. So perhaps for Sony, it's competency around miniaturization. Then there are market access related competencies. So competencies that interface between the company and its customers. Perhaps for USAAF, a large American insurance company that focuses just on armed forces and their families, it's competency in interacting with those targeted customers. And then the final type, the Fowler et al. Talk about integration related competencies, and that is how the organisation links that technical competency through to the market. So typically things like specific approach to manufacturing or Zara's fast cycle fashion competency. Now remember, these are types of competencies and not specific competencies. So you can't just say they have a functionally related competency. You have to identify what that competency actually is. Another difficulty in identifying competencies is pitching those competencies at the right level. You can liken this to the Goldilocks and the Three Bears fairy story, when Goldilocks, walking through the woods, comes across a cottage and goes into the cottage, and laid out on the table are 3 bowls of porridge. 1 bowl which is too hot, 1 bowl that's too cold, and 1 bowl that's just about right. This is analogous to actually thinking about the level at which a competency is operating at. Too generic a definition, perhaps just talking about technology, well, is not going to be unique. All firms are going to have some form of technology. Go too far the other way and pitch in too much detail. Perhaps a chip in a microprocessor. It might be unique, but it's not going to make a difference in terms of whether customers are choosing that company or not. So you're looking to brainstorm in an iterative way to find the right level to define those competencies at, so that the competency is pitched just at the right level. Another way to illustrate this, you want something to hang on your wall. Well, perhaps you'll choose a piece of cloth. Now, is that likely to be valuable? Is it likely to be difficult to copy by others? No, there are plenty of pieces of cloth that you could hang on your wall. It's too much of a generic wall hanging. Perhaps a nice painting from one of the shops you find in many East Asian cities these days, which are crammed full of various pictures. Well, perhaps a little bit more valuable than a piece of cloth, still unlikely to be difficult for others to copy. Perhaps you specify which painting you want. I want a copy of the Mona Lisa. These you'd have to spend a little bit more money to obtain. So a little bit more value, but still is likely to be copyable by others who might want the same thing. Perhaps a Banksy copy like this of the Mona Lisa. Well, here we are starting to talk of something of significant value, but there are a few of these images around. So whilst it is going to be highly valuable, it is not unique. What about the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci? Well, it's priceless. There's only one in the world, and that clearly, if you own it, would be valuable and unique. But the Mona Lisa itself is made up of various components. So perhaps we want a set of paints that came from the same year that Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa. Not valuable, but nowhere near as valuable as that bundle of resources, that competency that is the Mona Lisa itself. Go further, perhaps just 1 tube of paint from that time, less valuable still. Perhaps some powder that is used to make up that paint, less valuable still. Perhaps the rock that powder is extracted from to make the paint, still of less value. So what we're seeing here, and the analogy here to make, is that you're looking for competencies that are just set at the right level. Too generic, perhaps you talk about technology as a whole, are unlikely to be rare and unique. You go in too much detail down to individual resources, and it's very likely that others are going to be able to copy those, or it is not going to be of significant value. So you're trying to find the right level of bundling in an integrated whole to make a competency that has a chance of being the source of competitive advantage. Now, do make sure that you are focusing onto resources, and remember that competencies as bundles of resources are still resources. So be careful not to stray into activities or into strategies or descriptions. Things like activities you'll pick up when you're doing a Porter analysis. Things like strategies and strategic moves you'll pick up when doing another form of analysis. So focus your attention just onto resources and competencies. And here is a list of some of the common mistakes I see in this space of things that are called competencies that are not. things like strategies. A marketing strategy, it's not a competency. You should be looking at what is the competency that allows you to do that strategy. Generic types or functions. We've already talked about technology. Perhaps marketing. That's an activity. Or if you're saying it's a marketing competency, it could be very generic. Lots of companies will have a marketing competency. You have to be more specific in your definition. R&D or innovation. Well, those are activities rather than competencies. And we could go on. Products or diverse products. Okay, what's the competency that allows you to produce and deliver those products? Low price or differentiation, those are strategies. And again, think about what are the competencies that allow you to do those strategies. Economies of scale and scope, again, these are not competencies. You have to ask what are the competencies in which you have scale that means you have an advantage. Or first mover advantage or market share. Again, you need to think about what are the competencies you have that allow you to be the first mover or allow you to gain that market share. Now, once you've identified a number of competencies, you have to then test each one to see if they can be a source of competitive advantage. Now, the way you test each competency is with Jay Barney's VRIRO test. Now, the VRIRO test was brought in his 1995 article looking inside for competitive advantage, and it supersedes an earlier framework that Jay Barney developed called the VRIN test. I would recommend using the VRIRO test, but if you prefer the VRIN test, that is fine. Now, the letters in VRIRO simply stand for the 4 parts of the test. The V stands for valuable. And here you're looking at whether the competency is valuable in terms of creating opportunities or neutralizing threats. And here it's useful to think about, is the value that's being created by that competency is significant relative to the size of the firm. So you really are looking at the competencies that are most valuable. The second part of the test, the R in VRIRO, is rare. Is that competency or resource scarce or unique compared to competitors? And then the third part of the VRIRO test, the I, stands for inimitable or non-copyable, if you like. So is that competency hard or impossible to copy by others or easily substituted? Now, Barney talks about a number of reasons why a resource or a competency might be difficult to copy. And he talks about historic circumstances, causal ambiguity, or complex social relationships. Now, in terms of historic circumstances, what he's talking about here is whether there was a period in the past where a firm was able to acquire a resource, but the context has changed since then, making it almost impossible for others to acquire the same thing. A great example here is Caterpillar, the earth-moving equipment manufacturer. Now, Caterpillar, at the start of the Second World War, won the contract with the US military to provide equipment support to the US military in all areas of operations across the world. And the US military paid to help Caterpillar set up its logistics network to enable that service. Now, Caterpillar retained that logistics system after the Second World War, and is the basis of why it can offer to deliver any part to anywhere in the world within 48 hours. And that is hugely appealing to customers, potentially on penalty clauses in large-scale construction projects. But for other organisations, to build the same competency would be prohibitively expensive without government support, and that is not going to be realised. Interestingly, Caterpillar's big global competitor, Komatsu, could not replicate what Caterpillar does, so has tried to substitute that competency by building greater reliability into their equipment, and so have less downtime and needing that support intervention. Because of ambiguity, or elsewhere Barney talks about this as numerous small decisions, This is about the sheer complexity of the competency, the resource, such that it's extremely difficult to work out how it all works together. Even to the extent that the people working in the organisation don't really know how it works. That makes it extremely difficult for another firm to build the same thing. The social complexity is all about those relationships between people and different organisations, built up over many years and involve trust and knowledge and mutual adjustment to each other's approaches to things. Again, very difficult for others to copy. And then the final part of the Vriro test, the O, is organisation. And this is about whether or not the firm gains the value from that competency. So the firm appropriates the value from that competency. A good example of where this doesn't happen is in the fund management industry. Perhaps in a fund manager you have a particular individual who is a specialist on a particular type of asset and trades on behalf of the company in that asset, applying their know-how. Now clearly there's a resource there that potentially provides competitive advantage. But in terms of the level of bonuses and salary the fund manager has to pay to that individual, often it's not the firm that captures the value, but the individual fund manager. So a competency that is delivering value, it's rare, it's inimitable, but the organisation is not appropriating the value from that competency. Now, you work through those 4 aspects of the Vriro test for each competency. Don't lump all the competencies together and do one Vriro test. You have to do it on each individual competency. And the output of the Vriro test tells you if and what type of competitive advantage the competency provides. Now, obviously, if a competency or resource is not valuable, not rare, not difficult to imitate, well, it's not going to provide competitive advantage. And indeed, in the fact that it's not valuable, it is purely a cost on the business and therefore is putting the organisation at a disadvantage. If you've got a competency that is valuable but it isn't rare and isn't difficult to copy, that gives you competitive parity. A competency within annual financial reporting is something that all organisations have to have. They have to submit financial reports each year. So it's valuable to have that competency, but every organisation has the same thing, and therefore it is not going to provide a competitive advantage. Where resource is valuable and rare, it means that the firm does have a competitive advantage. It's valuable, so customers are potentially coming to the organisation because that resource it allows it to do something. It's rare and therefore none or very few of its competitors have the same thing, so it has an advantage. However, if that competency or resource is not inimitable, that means that competitors can copy or get hold of the same competency and resource. And given that competency is driving an advantage, it's highly likely that competitors will try to copy it. And therefore that competency gives temporary competitive advantage. But where a resource is valuable, rare, and it's difficult or impossible to copy, that gives the organisation the potential for sustainable competitive advantage, which, if the organisation is set up to gain the value from that competency, will provide sustainable competitive advantage into, as Barney says, into the foreseeable future. Now, for all theories, there are limitations. And the criticisms that are applied to the RBV theory are firstly that it's difficult for organisations to implement. Although, as we've seen in this video, there are some tips you can follow to help you in that implementation. Also, across RBV theories, there is an inconsistency in the use of terminology. Unlike in the strategy as choice perspective, where Michael Porter dominates and so the terminology is very consistent, different theorists in the resource-based view will use different terms, competencies or capabilities, resources, strategic assets, etc. to describe the same thing. Now, to overcome that, when using RBV, you need to decide on a consistent set of definitions and agree that with the people that you're working with so they all are discussing the same things. Perhaps deeper criticisms are that in a dynamic world, for competencies to be inimitable or non-substitutable for the foreseeable future is unlikely. And so some theorists say a more dynamic view is required. And RBV says little about how resources and competencies change over time. Those last 2 points we'll pick up in another study unit where we will look at a development of the RBV theory called dynamic capabilities. So, RBV in summary. Well, firstly, the theory suggests that competitive advantage results from bundles of heterogeneous and immobile resources, i.e. different and difficult to copy bundles of resources that the firm possesses. Now, core competencies are a combination of tangible and intangible resources integrated together so that the sum of the parts of those resources working together makes the whole more than that sum of the parts. Now, core competencies pass the Vrara test. They generate value for the firm. They're rare, unique, and they're inimitable, so difficult or impossible to copy, and the organisation appropriates the value from them. Now, in this theory, management focus should be on competition at the level of competencies and also on how it exploits the most value from the competencies that it possesses. But the resource-based view has been criticised for providing little guidance on how competencies are developed and managed, and that is something we'll pick up in a different theory called dynamic capabilities. Thank you for listening.